The civil war in Cambodia was fought between the forces of the Communist Party of Kampuchea, Khmer Rouge, against the government forces of the Kingdom of Cambodia and the Khmer Republic after October 1970. The war was fought between March 11, 1967 and April 17, 1975. This means that the war also coincided with the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and the Laos Civil War. Consequently, it also widened the front of the Vietnam War and allowed for the North Vietnam to invade Cambodia, which made matters worse. North Vietnam invading Cambodia caused the Cambodian genocide. This was one of the most prominent genocides in history, with nearly 3 million people being killed. The Khmer Rouge was a Marxist organization and shared similarities with the North Vietnamese troops. It was easy for North Vietnam to come and invade Cambodia since they had similar ideals. North Vietnam also secured the protection and means of the supply lines in Cambodia. The attack sparked the development of the Vietnamese-Cambodian War, which only lasted from 1978 to 1979, because as soon as Vietnam became involved with Cambodia, China attacked Vietnam's borders. Even with being ruled by a communist regime, Cambodia was generally uninvolved with the Cold War. Yet this led to Cambodia to sever ties with the US and ally with China instead, another communist country. Cambodia being uninvolved caused the Prime Minister of Cambodia at this time, who was King Norodom Sihanouk, to be classified as a communist sympathizer. This was also perpetuated by his decision to allow North Vietnam to hold secret resources, which just created more tensions in Cambodia. A series of incidents also occurred throughout the Southeast Asia that led to the Civil War. First of all, a huge economic crisis, which resulted in class conflict and regional instability from the war in Vietnam, contributed to setting the conditions for a successful insurgency. Lots of Western governments were unsupportive of the government in Cambodia and refused to trade with them. This issue even persisted into the 1990s. Rural and regional instability allowed for the Khmer Rouge, which had been a secretive ongoing force, to now rise as they begin to target the unstable areas of Cambodia. The Sam Lao uprising also contributed to the rise of the Khmer Rouge. It catalyzed the unstable economic situation as farmers began to see an increase in taxes and economic inequality ran rampant. This discontent was also received by the Chinese government and the Vietnamese government as being communist. Crop prices also dropped to new lows. The uprising started when 2 soldiers were murdered when collecting rice, forcibly. Communist parties were blamed, and the actual issue at hand was once again forgotten. Rural people and communities were burned, and resistance to the government spread. The rural population didn't want to support the oppressive communist regimes that were starting to take place in Vietnam and Cambodia. They were forced by the military to be displaced from their homes and support the communist government, taking a rise in Southeast Asia. With the increasing power of the communist regimes led by Jen Lon Nol, they planned a coup on the government, which successfully replaced the former leader, King Norodom Sihanouk, with Jen Lon Nol. The coup was mainly successful because of how weak the Cambodian army was from lack of resources and depletion over a former event that happened before this. North Vietnam also had significant involvement in the coup. They had decided to invade eastern Cambodia. North Vietnam's army involvement was meant to protect its base all over eastern Cambodia. This helped pursue military efforts in South Vietnam. March through June of 1970, the North Vietnamese captured most of the northeastern third of the country in engagements with the Cambodian army. Overall, the Cambodian Civil War had caused a huge refugee crisis, with almost 25 million people displaced and in need of a home. The Khmer Rouge had also committed a series of war crimes and atrocities that they had to been forcibly removed from the city for. The Cuban Revolution was an armed revolt led by Fidel Castro against the government of Fulgencio Batista from July 26 to 1953 to January 1st, 1959. Fulgencio Batista used dictatorial measures to ensure that he remained in control, even as going far as postponing elections. After Carlos Perio Socaras became president in 1948, his domestic policies seemed unobtainable and led to both issues in the economy and the government corruption. Batista overthrew the government in 1952, closed Congress, and called for elections to be held in 1954. Support for him collapsed over time, and the increasing economic crises because of sugar exports and collapse of the agriculture industry continued to increase. The revolution started, however, when there was an attempt to overthrow Batista's regime and a failed attack on Santiago de Cuba's military barracks. Castro noticed this, and the movement was formally led thereafter. The revolution started. Fidel Castro led an early militant anti-Batista protests and organizations. In 1955, he traveled to Mexico to start training a disciplined guerrilla force. Leaders of the movement elsewhere began to implement other social institutions in Cuba, like free housing for peasants, nationalization of public services, fair elections, and free and accessible education for all. Castro trained 82 men and led an attempted attack on Cuba in 1956. Most of the men died because Batista had learned about the attack beforehand and sent reinforcements to take care of them. 20 of them, however, were able to escape, including one of the most important revolutionaries in Cuban history, Che Guevara. After the attack, Cuba remained in a constant state of war and destruction. Rebel forces attacked the government, and other aspects of Batista's regime were destroyed. Most significantly were the sugar plantations. The government, in response to all of this resistance, suspected that if anyone was being a communist or collaborating with Castro, they would be persecuted. This was also similar to the Red Scare in the United States. Support for the revolution seemed to decline, so Batista had a stronger military now and was more aggressive towards revolutionaries. But the revolutionaries fought back harder and forced Batista's army to withdraw. The press had a strong report on the resistance movement, and the revolution continued to grow. By 1958, the revolutionaries had an advantage. They had forced Batista to free the island in 1959. The presidential election still occurred in 1958, yet support for Batista declined significantly. Guevara and Castro decided to make another attempt and fought at the Battle of Santa Clara. Batista fled to the Dominican Republic when rebel forces bore down in Cuba, and Fidel Castro tied up loose ends and led the government after that. After the Cuban revolutions, trade between Cuba and the U.S. significantly declined as it became a communist country. They had had many economic failures that forged close ties with the Soviet Union. Throughout history, wars were similar and different in their own manners. The Cambodian Civil War and the Cuban Revolution support this statement. Although the wars fell under different timelines, they both occurred during the Cold War. Both wars had a clear battle objective, and that was fighting against the government forces that belonged to their oppositions. The Cambodian Civil War consisted of a war fought against the government forces of the Kingdom of Cambodia and the Khmer Republic, whilst the Cuban Revolution, too, consisted of an armed revolt against the government of Fulgencio Batista. Throughout the fight, these two wars have had their fair share of failures. Cambodian Civil War causing a huge refugee crisis with nearly 25 million people displaced, and the failed attempted attack on Cuba during the Cuban Revolution. These failures caused negative impacts amongst the parties involved, from casualties to war crimes left and right. Although similarities were present, these two wars had a big share of differences throughout the fight. Starting off with the obvious, the two wars were in completely different locations and time frames. Cambodia, located in Asia, and Cuba in North America, the wars started about 14 years apart. As wars are bound to have casualties, there was a huge gap in terms of number of deaths amongst these wars. These two may have both been classified as battles, but there is a major difference between revolutions and civil wars. A revolution's goal is to fight for a new system, overthrowing a government, whereas a civil war is fought between people amongst the same country. The Cuban Revolution was led by one man, Fidel Castro. The Cambodian Civil War occurred throughout Vietnam, not led or started necessarily by one person. The Cambodian Civil War, known as the one of the most prominent genocides in history, suffered nearly 3 million deaths. The Cuban Revolution came nowhere close, with casualties falling under about a few hundred. These few factors within these battles show how similar, yet vastly different, they were in their unique ways.